Well, thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. And on behalf of tonight's sponsors and hosts, and in partnership with the Trinity Forum, I welcome you to the second Atlanta Evening Conversation, a conversation focused on the themes of character, civility, and pluralism. Character flaws or failings among our leaders, uncivil speech and actions among sparring factions, and lack of empathy or acceptance or outright hostility among groups of different races, religions, or political persuasions make our daily headlines. When our leaders display or engage in such speech or behavior, a new lower societal norm in these arenas follows. This has exposed a lack of depth and breadth in our faith and moral underpinnings, even among those who make Christian or other faith claims. There's a hole in our gospel, if you will. For us to be agents of redemption, perhaps our holiest earthly call, our faith should inform our understanding and actions. And we need people of faith calling upon the wisdom and heart of our Creator to be committed to this epic battle. While character and civility are relatively easy concepts to understand and share broad public support, at least nominally, albeit being very hard to master, this evening's topic, pluralism, often creates a discomfort and unease within the faith community. It asks difficult, sometimes messy questions of us. And it requires us, certainly, to get out of our comfort zone. Think about the question, what does love require of me? So how better to inform this conversation than to draw upon the best of Christian thought, inclusive of participation with other faith traditions? And I know no better organization to guide such a conversation for such a time as this than the Trinity Forum, who has, for a generation, provided a platform for leaders and influencers to engage the great questions of life and issues of the day within the context of faith. Their range of offerings, from their pamphlets to curated daily articles on culture, to their networks of speakers, to their specialized curricula, to their evening conversations, of which tonight is one, are both comprehensive in scope and unsurpassed in their quality in the furtherance of this mission to renew society through the renewal of its leaders. With tonight's speakers, we bring a great tandem that we trust will enlighten, challenge, and inspire us on this central and timely topic. Following tonight's event, we would like to hear back from you. What resonated with you? What troubled you? What inspiration, if any, you took away, suggestions you have for how we can be better, who should be here that's not, and so on. But please enjoy the conversation, and please join in the conversation. It is now my pleasure to bring up the president of the Trinity Forum, Sheree Harder, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that introduction. I would just like to add my own welcome to all of you for joining us for tonight's evening conversation on confident pluralism in a turbulent age. As David mentioned, this is actually the second evening conversation we've done in Atlanta as part of a broad initiative on character, civility, and pluralism. Our hope for this initiative is really quite an ambitious one, that at a time when our public discourse and our leadership on a national level has become increasingly polarized, overheated, even unreliable, that these gatherings will provide a place for conversation about, and even a sort of catechesis about first principles, the nature and necessity of character, civility, and pluralism, what they mean for ourselves, our communities, and our country. I'd like to start off just to acknowledge and thank our sponsors and members of the steering committee that made this evening and others possible. Jack Alexander, David Allman, who you just heard from, Jim and Julie Balloon, Chris Batchelder, Mark DeMoss, Susanna Dryman, John Featherston, Price and Nancy Harding, the Lovett School, Jenny Pruitt, Matt Teague, who's also a trustee of ours, and Scotland and Peggy Wright. Thank you so much for all you've done to make this evening possible. Yeah, that deserves it. I'd also like to acknowledge just a few special guests in the audience tonight. We're delighted to be joined by Robert Franklin and his wife Cheryl. Robert actually served as the respondent during our last evening conversation in discussion with David Brooks, who did absolutely spectacular job. If you haven't seen it, we encourage you to do so. And I'd also like to welcome two of our trustees who have flown in from out of town to be here, George Clark and Brian Johnson. Really delighted you would make the effort. But first and foremost, we are delighted that each one of you is here tonight, that you've turned out. And we know that there are many people who wanted to be here but couldn't be. And if you know one of these people, tell them, fear not. There will be a chance to see tonight's proceedings. We will post the video on our Facebook page. You can also follow along on Facebook and on Twitter, and there will be photos to tag on Facebook as well. If this is your first event and you're not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And as David mentioned, we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon the classic works of the humanities and ties them to the timely issues of the day, as well as programs such as the one tonight, to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging those big questions of life, and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. One of the great questions, which seems particularly acute and urgent in our increasingly fractured time, is how we are to live together as neighbors, friends, and fellow citizens in the midst of deep differences which threaten to divide us. By many measures, our country is more polarized than it has been since the Civil War. We feel this keenly in the divisiveness and the nastiness of the last presidential election. We see it in the clashes between law enforcement and minority communities, in the challenges to religious liberty, in the on-air policy debates that quickly devolve into shouting matches, and in the misspelled invective that characterizes most of our social media communication. But even as Americans grow increasingly diverse religiously, ideologically, ethnically, and in terms of background, we have also become increasingly segmented along financial, educational, and social and ideological lines. It grows ever easier to confine our socializing, our conversation, even our news feed to those with whom we agree, even as the country as a large and as a whole is getting more and more diverse. So in the midst of such increasing fragmentation, how do we learn to live with, how do we learn to care for, and how do we learn to love the neighbor with whom we disagree so deeply? Our speakers tonight will make the case that there is much to be gained by embracing a confident pluralism, one that acknowledges deep differences between people and what the implications of those differences are, but also encourages the patience, humility, and respect that is needed to live together in peace, and provides the framework for us to attempt to persuade others of what we hold to be right and true, rather than simply fight those we believe to be wrong. It is both a provocative and a hopeful argument to make, and there are few who can make it with the insight, expertise, or the vantage point of friendship across some philosophical, political, and theological differences than our speakers this evening, John Inazu and Eboo Patel. John is the Sally Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion, as well as a professor of political science at Washington University in St. Louis. There, he teaches criminal law, law and religion, and various seminars on the First Amendment. His scholarship focuses largely on First Amendment and freedoms of speech, assembly, and the related political and legal questions that arise. He's also a senior fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies of Culture at UVA, and prior to joining the faculty, he was an assistant professor at Duke University School of Law, also clerked for Judge Roger Woolman of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit, and served for 4 years as Associate General Counsel with the Department of the Air Force at the Pentagon. He writes broadly for a number of publications, including USA Today, CNN, The Washington Post, the LA Times, the Hedgehog Review, as well as too many law journals to mention. His first book, Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, was published by Yale University Press, and his second book, Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference, was published by the University of Chicago and has drawn critical acclaim. In addition to John, we'll be hearing tonight from Eboo Patel, who is the founder and the president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, a national nonprofit that partners with institutions of higher education to make interfaith cooperation and civic service a priority. He's the author of Acts of Faith, which won the Louisville Grawemeyer Award in Religion, as well as his works Sacred Ground and Interfaith Leadership. Named by U.S. News & World Report as one of America's best leaders in 2009, Eboo has also served on President Obama's Interfaith Council, served as a speaker at TED, as well as at the Nobel Peace Prize Foundation and the Clinton Global Initiative, and has written for the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, USA Today, and many other publications as well. He holds a doctorate of sociology in religion from Oxford University, where he studied as a Rhodes Scholar. Immediately after John's opening remarks, we'll hear remarks from Eboo, and then both speakers and I will engage in a moderated conversation up here on stage. During that time, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions, and I think all of you will have on your chair a short piece of paper where you can write your questions. Many of my colleagues will be collecting them, so be thinking in advance of the questions you'd like to ask the speakers and for them to tackle later on this evening. With that, John, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thanks for coming out, and thank you to Cherie and the Trinity Forum for sponsoring this event. It's especially a delight to be with my friend Eboo, so thank you for joining me again for the tour that we're doing, talking about these questions. And I'll say also, just as a moment of personal gratitude to Eboo, I'm on the board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and I'm not authorized to speak for the organization ever, but I kind of will anyway, and just say thank you for your friendship to InterVarsity and all you've done on colleges' campuses to help Christian ministries thrive there, and I'm grateful for that as well as for our friendship. I'm going to talk tonight for a little bit about my book, Confident Pluralism, to lay out some of the general ideas, and then Eboo will have some devastating critiques, and then we'll have a conversation to follow. But I want to start actually with to take you all back to a story that happened earlier this year in what it would have been a run-of-the-mill, low-level Senate confirmation hearing for a man named Russell Vogt, appointed somewhere in the Office of Management and Budget. Russell Vogt was a graduate of Wheaton College, and during the hearing, Senator Sanders had come across some of his previous writings, and in one of those writings, Vogt had been talking about Islam and said something to the effect of, Muslims, because they don't believe in Jesus, stand condemned. So Sanders picked up that quote and was very concerned during the hearing and said to Russell Vogt, this does not sound right to me that you would say this. I'm not going to vote for this nominee. This is not what America's about. And I saw that exchange in the press and watched the replay of the hearing, and I thought to myself, actually, with due respect, Senator Sanders, I think this is exactly what America's about. It's about figuring out to live with our very deepest differences, the ones that matter. Now, Senator Sanders would have been perfectly entitled to question nominee Vogt about whether he would treat, under the equal protection of the law, Muslims and others to the same standards that the Constitution demands. That's fair game. But to go after someone and to say you are not what America's about because you hold firm beliefs that many believers of many faiths hold that are exclusive truth claims seems to me to be not what America's about. I wrote Senator Sanders a letter, sent him a copy of my book. Haven't heard back yet, but I'm holding out hope on that one. That's just one example of the differences that we actually do have in this society, and we don't need to think about Senate confirmation hearings to internalize this. So think with me about your own reactions, positively or negatively, to words or phrases or people like evangelical Christian or Muslim or atheist or Black Lives Matter or Make America Great Again? What do the words and the phrases and the people that these ideas conjure up remind us that we are actually quite divided and we don't see differences very well? And these differences cut to some pretty deep questions like, what is the purpose of our country? What's the meaning of human flourishing? What does it mean to be a human being? These are no small matters, and we're deeply divided about them. And this cuts against the narrative that we like to tell ourselves from high school civics class, that we are one nation indivisible, that we're in pursuit of a more perfect union. And in fact, we are maybe more defined by our differences than by what we hold in common. This maybe always has, but increasingly leads us to a practical problem in need of a political solution. How do we get along with each other in the midst of these differences? The French philosopher Rousseau gave us one answer. He said, "It is impossible for men to live at peace with those they think are damned." So that's a pretty bleak pronouncement, and I hope that Rousseau is wrong. And the book I've written is an effort to say that he is wrong, and to say that instead of this idea of a pretend fake unity about everything we have in common, we might aim for a more modest unity where we can learn to live with the actual differences among us. That's the idea behind confident pluralism. Both of those words are important. Confidence without pluralism will miss the reality of politics, and it will end up suppressing difference, sometimes with violence. And pluralism without confidence misses the reality of people. It ends up papering over difference for the sake of false unity or feigned agreement. Confident pluralism takes the differences seriously and insists that we find a way to manage to get along with our differences. Now, for some people in this country, this idea of difference and the reality among us is really largely just beginning to dawn, and that's especially true, I think, for white Protestants, of which I am half of one. And by that I mean I'm half white, not half Protestant. And one of the reasons that it's especially hard for white Protestants to recognize the reality of pluralism today is that as recently as a generation ago, this country was largely undergirded by white Protestant institutions in the white middle class. And these institutions, at the time, most people went to a church of some kind, whether they were devout or not, and the institutions undergirded a kind of morality in the white middle class. That's changed as the Catholic writer Joseph Bottom has observed. The collapse of mainline Protestant institutions is one of the most significant social facts of our recent history. And that has to be right? The absence of these institutions, the absence of a shared, even if vague, moral, cultural framework has put increased pressure on what it means to be the United States today. Now, that comes with some upsides and some downsides. There is a sense in which there's a loss of coherence, but there's also a sense in which a greater recognition of the differences among us and the different voices that are actually here is quite a good thing. And I think that for Christians, among other people, this is a moment of opportunity. As Tim Keller and I have written, this is a moment to say that, as a reminder that this world is not our own, that we're part of a world around us, and that we're called to engage, to love God and to love neighbor in the midst of it. As we think about the reality, I think one important observation is that there's no past to which we might return. There's no golden era to look back upon. And the reason that's the case is that it becomes very difficult to name when that time period would be. Going back to the 1950s is not a good bargain for African Americans. Going back to the 1940s is not a good idea for Japanese Americans, like my grandparents interned by the US government during the Second World War. And so we only have the present reality and how to deal with it. And that's the focus of the argument for confident pluralism. There are two dimensions to this argument, one legal and one personal. I'm going to spare you most of the legal tonight, but if you are interested, I do talk about it in my book. To tease it just a little bit, though, I'll mention, I think part of the key to the legal protections needed to navigate pluralism and difference effectively in society is paradoxically doubling down on the protections that allow us to differ. So the protections for private groups to form on their own, to live into ideas and viewpoints that differ from majoritarian norms and from what the state says, and to allow kind of flourishing in the private sector. And I think my hunch is that we have the resources for this kind of legal project best represented in the right of assembly, which Cherie mentioned is the subject of my first book. Assembly, interestingly, only about 1 in 10 Americans can name it as a right in the First Amendment. So if you knew it was there, you are in the elite circles there of constitutional knowledge. But assembly is also quite unique. It's one of 5 rights in the First Amendment, the others being speech, press, petition, and religion. And it's the only right that cannot be exercised alone. You have to have at least 2 people to assemble. You can do all the other things on your own in some forms, right? You can start a blog, you can speak even if no one's listening, you can petition the government, and you can do forms of religious practice on your own. You cannot assemble alone. And so what I think that does is suggest that even from the get-go of the Constitution, the framers recognize this right in the sets of values and theories undergirding the right that says something about the relational dimension of how we engage in society, that we aren't just individuals, but the groups that we form matter and our relationships with each other matter. I think that's part of what underlies maybe a way forward with our constitutional approach to pluralism and difference. But I want to spend maybe a little more time talking about the personal approach, since most of us are not going to shape constitutional doctrine. And that is to say, what do we do in our daily lives when the law runs out? It turns out we have a lot of freedom to pursue our own forms of discourse without the law telling us what to do. Our free speech law generally says you can say whatever you want to whomever you want. There are some restrictions, right? Does someone want to name one? What's the one we always hear? You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, except I'm quick to say, unless the building's on fire, in which case you can yell fire. But generally you can't yell fire, you can't commit perjury, you can't form a criminal conspiracy, you can't engage in insider trading, but that's about it. Outside of that, you get to say what you want, even when you damage and harm other people. And that puts a lot of responsibility on us to choose how we engage in our speech with other people. And so I've suggested that we might think about 3 civic aspirations to frame this approach: tolerance, humility, and patience. And I'm just going to set these ideas up for you. Starting with tolerance. By tolerance, I don't mean the common definition of tolerance that is often pervasive on college campuses today, the kind of tolerance that demands acceptance. You do not tolerate me fully unless you accept everything about me and my beliefs. And that's not what I don't think tolerance is. Tolerance is really a kind of endurance of the other that respects people but doesn't necessarily respect ideas. And we know that to be the case because we all hold ideas in this room that other people find crazy and other people find morally reprehensible. And yet we have to live in society with each other. So tolerance can't actually be acceptance, but it does mean distinguishing people from ideas and the willingness to engage with those different ideas. Humility takes it a step further and says, not only do we recognize the ways in which we disagree with other people, but we can't always prove why we are right and they are wrong. And part of the reason for that is that we, in some of our most deeply held first premises, we hold beliefs that other people can't fully understand. We can't argue rationally to explain to them why we believe what we do or why what they believe is wrong. So there's a limit in our discourse. It's not a limit on truth or big T truth claims, but it's a limit in how we engage with other people. And it suggests that we might, in a kind of humility, recognize that some of our own ideas and own beliefs are not fully accessible to other people. And then patience, the idea that we might at least start with a posture that listens, that seeks to empathize and to understand. And that doesn't mean we end up agreeing. In fact, our patient listening might lead us to conclude all the more that another's viewpoint is harmful or wrong or disturbing. But it suggests that our initial posture would be one of willingness to listen and to understand. Tolerance, humility, and patience. I think these ideas can help us start to bridge, if not ideological differences, at least relational difference, which is a good first step. But we can only do so if we begin by naming the depths of our differences accurately, without papering over them or pretending that they don't exist. Otherwise, tolerance will become that demand for acceptance, and humility will be replaced by a kind of moral certainty, and patience will lose to outrage. These are real risks, and as Cherie sort of suggested at the beginning, in some ways they seem to be getting harder structurally. They're harder politically and nationally. They're harder when we think about our social media practices and where we choose to live geographically and who we listen to and what we learn. And so the challenges are real. And that leads to the question of whether there's hope in this message. One reviewer of my book early on, who was otherwise fairly kind to me, said, "This book is doomed to immediate irrelevance." And he thought this was the case because he didn't think there would be an audience that could comprehend it or want to understand it. I think, and I hope he's wrong, and not just because I want to sell books, but because I actually do think that when we look back at the history of our country, it is a history that, against great odds, has overcome significant differences. And it's no small thing when we look back, even at the founding, and sometimes we say, well, how hard was it for a bunch of white Protestant men to get along with each other since they were the ones with political power? But elsewhere in the world, they were killing each other at the time. And that's no small victory. And so I think we look back at that with some optimism for the future, even in really hard times. And then for Christians who know and live our lives with the end of the story in mind, and knowing that God's time is not our time, and knowing that God is in control, all the more reason to hold out a confidence and a hope. Or to put it differently, we might pursue tolerance, humility, and patience all the more because we ground our lives in faith and hope and love. And so I hope that as Eboo talks and as we get into the discussion, we can think through maybe some practical examples of where this hits the ground. And for those of us who either are wishing to be challenged more or might not want to be challenged, but where are those spaces, the messy places where we're called to engage and to intersect and to take risks for the sake of our common humanity and our common civic practices, but also for those of us who are Christians for the sake of the gospel and our witness for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. I love hearing those stories. So I wanted to take up on John's theme of what should give us hope. And John talks about in his really, really excellent book, I remember reading about the first half of it on a flight and thinking to myself, we are going to assign this to IFYC staff. It's the clearest, most compelling argument that I know for this concept called confident pluralism. And one of the things that John talks about is, what ought to give us hope, right? Because John is a legal scholar and a political philosopher. He approaches it in one way. I'm going to approach it in a slightly different way as a sociologist, especially one who focuses not on numbers and quantitative data, but instead on smaller situations, on ethnography and qualitative data. And I'll begin with a very mundane story. So I have a 10-year-old, and we put him in summer camp, and he's going down the list of the other kids in the summer camp, and he says, "Mom, some of these kids are mean," right? And we think to ourselves, "Oh boy, did we mess up?" Right? So send him off to this first day of summer camp, and he comes back, it's happy as a clam. Zaid, what happened to the mean kids? Well, they weren't mean at the summer camp. Very interesting, right? 10-year-old insight. It means that all of us have experienced this oftentimes between school and summer camp, right? That there's a set of people who are mean at school, and there's a set of people, and those very same people aren't mean in this other setting. What does that suggest? That meanness is not necessarily a property of an individual, but a quality of a social situation. What else does it suggest? That those of us who design social situations, people who are coaches, who are teachers, who are principals, who are camp counselors and directors of summer camps, we actually have a stunning amount of influence upon the world. It's very simple. You can design a situation in which it is easier for people to be in conflict. And you can design a situation in which it is easier for people to cooperate. There's actually really good social psychology on this. So some decades back, a social psychologist named Muzaffar Sharif, interestingly, in a study on a summer camp, takes a group of 12, 13-year-old boys to a camp in the state of Kansas called Robbers Cave. And he splits them into two groups. And immediately, these 12 and 13-year-old boys build literally a tribal identity within their groups. They give their groups names, the Eagles and the Rattlers. They give their groups songs and flags and chants, and no small amount of this is directed in opposition to the other group. Sharif and his colleagues begin slowly to design a set of activities intended to have these kids at each other's throats. So, for example, they say there's going to be a pizza party one night. They invite the Eagles at 5:30 and the Rattlers at 5:45. How do you think the Rattlers feel when they show up at 5:45 and the pizza is, if anybody knows 13-year-old boys, gone? Right? They have to separate the kids physically. They have designed an environment in which these 13-year-old boys are at each other's throats. The following week, they create a whole new set of activities. For example, they put the boys in a bus together, they take them to the swimming pool, and they have the bus fall into a ditch. And the only way to get the bus out of the ditch is for all of these kids to work together and pull on the rope and push on the back of the bus to get it out of the ditch. This is, again, famous social psychology experiment called the Robbers Cave experiment. A week full of activities like this. Lo and behold, a new sort of identity starts to emerge, a super identity, a Robbers Cave camp identity. My guess is that we have all been in a situation like that, right? But it actually says an awful lot about human nature, and I think it suggests no small amount of hope in the world. Part of what I want to do, I told this story to John earlier today, is I want to give people a sense of just how deep this runs in the human psyche, which is to say that we respond to the role that we are invisibly assigned in a social situation. I'm going to say that again. We respond to and live out the role we are invisibly assigned in a social situation, right? So in perhaps the most famous study done of this kind, have people heard of the Stanford prison experiment? Okay, so I'll thumbnail sketch it and I'll tell you a little interesting twist on this. So I saw a video of the Stanford prison experiment when I was in high school, a long time ago now, 25 some years ago, right? And a young Stanford junior professor named Philip Zimbardo on, one of those scratchy old film strips is narrating this experiment that he does with 19, 20-year-old healthy young guys from the Northern California area in the 1950s, early 1960s. And what he does is he takes 20 of these young men, again, 19, 20 years old, and he randomly, and they go through all the psychological battery of tests to ensure that they are all psychologically healthy. These are normal college kids home from Stanford and Berkeley on summer vacation, okay? He randomly assigns them different roles. Some are the prisoners in this prison experiment, and some are the jailers. And what is stunning is over the course of literally the next set of hours, 6, 8, 10, 12 hours, these young men transform from 19-year-old kids who might have been friends had they met each other on a soccer field or a baseball diamond into fully living out the role of jailer and prisoner. So the jailers scream at other young men who look at them. They wind up locking guys into solitary confinement, which gratuitous given the small infraction that's taken place. The prisoners start to act as prisoners, right? You can kind of see this happening. So here's my little twist on this story. So it turns out that 6, 7 years ago, I meet Philip Zimbardo. And I tell him just how influential seeing this Stanford prison experiment film strip was in my growing up. I tell him, it helped me explain my own experience of summer camp, which is these kids who are mean in school were nice in summer camp. I watched these people take upon the roles that they were assigned. He's like, let me tell you an even crazier part of this story. He, at the time, is dating a graduate student at Stanford who becomes his wife. And they're going on a date one night. And he says, I can't go to dinner at 7 because my experiment goes until 9. But we'll go get a slice of pizza at 9. Why don't you come by the experiment at 8 and I'll show you the last hour of this. This is clearly before the time of rules around research, right? And you will know why rules around research are required after I tell the story. So she comes in around 8, and he's in his control room with his other researchers, right? And this is bedtime in the prison. So the jailers are going through the bedtime regime. And Zimbardo tells his girlfriend, okay, so watch, they're going to come around the corner now, and the 4th prisoner is going to have his head down because he's exhausted after all these days. And the 3rd guard is going to push and scream at the 5th prisoner because they've been at it all week. He's narrating what is about to happen because he's now watched it for 7 or 8 days. And it happens just as he says. The 4th prisoner has his head down, looks exhausted. The 5th prisoner and a guard start going at it. The guard brings out a baton and threatens the prisoner. And at one point in this process, Zimbardo's girlfriend looks at him and says, Phil, that's not a jailer. That's a kid. Phil, you're not a warden. You're a professor. Phil Zimbardo had fallen into his own experiment. This guy who had designed a social psychology experiment had imperceptibly given himself the role warden. He was up in a control room. He had a one-way glass where he could see anything. And even though he got to go home at night and was taking notes and had a team of researchers, it was such a powerful situation. Now you all know why Keanu Reeves, made it so big in The Matrix, right? Because a social situation has a powerful impact on how we live our lives, which is to say, how we interact with other people. Any of us who are parents have a sense of this, right? I don't want my kid to be the nerd in this situation. I don't want my kid to be the bully in this situation. And the remarkable thing is, in a different situation, your kid could be an entirely different person. Nerdness, bulliness, meanness, kindness, not necessarily a property of an individual. Very much a quality of a social situation. We design social situations. Principals have an awful lot of influence over how 14-year-olds relate to each other in a school. Camp counselors have an awful lot of influence over how 11-year-olds relate to each other. Are we designing situations in which it is easier for people who are different to cooperate? Right? Final story. In my younger salad days, I helped to form an intentional community. Back then, we used the colloquial term hippie commune. When it was written up in the Chicago Tribune, it was described as a place smelling strongly of lentils. I do not deny that. It's 20 years old this week, and we had our reunion. And so it got me thinking about the impetus to create this place. And the impetus was a story called Stone Soup. We called the place Stone Soup. I'll tell you the Stone Soup story. For me, it's as good of an example of a leader who designed a situation where it was easier for people to cooperate. Many of you know the story. So there's a starving village, right? And people are fearful of each other. They stay in their huts in this village. They're worried that the person around the corner speaks a different language, that the person across the street prays to God in a different way. And they are, in a way, content to be alone and to starve. Traveler comes up through this village. She has a pack on her back, and in that pack she's got a large cauldron and a wooden ladle. She sets up a campfire in the center of town. She goes down to the river. She fills the pot with water. She has a third item in her pack, actually. She has a stone, a magic stone. And she goes back to the center of town, and she starts to stir this pot. And one of the kids, gets curious and opens the blinders in his house, and he sees this woman outside stirring water in this pot. And against his parents' wishes, runs out of the house and kind of hangs around this woman. And other kids start to follow this kid, and soon enough, the parents start to follow their own kids, and the village is gathered around this woman stirring this pot. And she takes the stone and she puts it in, and somebody says, "What are you doing?" And she points to the stone. She says, "I'm making stone soup." And of course, the villagers are all thrilled, right? They haven't eaten for days, weeks maybe. She stirs, and somebody says, "Well, is it done? We're hungry." She says, "It's almost there, but I think it needs some carrots." And somebody says, "Well, we've got carrots," and goes to the hiding place in their home, the place where nobody else would think to look for the carrots. They've hidden the carrots there. Brings out the carrots, brings it over to this woman. She chops them up and throws them in the pot. Stirs, tastes. Is it done yet? It's almost there. It needs some potatoes. Somebody says, "Well, we've got potatoes." Goes to their home, and in the hiding place where nobody would think to look, they've hidden away their last item of food, these potatoes. Brings it to the woman, chops them up, throws it in the pot, stirs, right? On and on and on. Almost there, needs some onions. Almost there, needs some turnips. Almost there, needs some salt. At the end of it all, this village feasts. And this woman quietly goes back to the river, washes out her pot, cleans off her stone, puts the ladle and the pot and the stone in her pack, goes on to the next starving village. It's the moral of this story. Here is a village with all the ingredients to feed itself. And they had created a social situation in which they were scared of each other, in which they were hiding their gifts, their ingredients, their qualities, right? And this woman rolls up into town, and she didn't say, "Hey, you fools, bring out your vegetables." Right? That's actually really important, right? That's actually really important. She could have said that, and it wouldn't have worked. Instead, what she did was to create a space in which it was easier for people to cooperate. She designed an activity, honestly, just like camp counselors do in summer camp. There are activities in which it is easier for people to cooperate, right? There are narratives, stories, feelings, and ethos in which it is easier for people to cooperate. I take John's book, Confident Pluralism, and I think to myself, we could do this all over this country, right? We could do this school by school, summer camp by summer camp, soccer league by soccer league. If we have enough, what we at IFYC call interfaith leaders, who are able to design environments in which it is easier for people to cooperate. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Eboo. Thank you, John. There's a lot there to unpack. But we'll start at the very beginning, which is you both talked about pluralism, but I think it might be helpful to hear a definition of what it actually is.
Sure. So I would say maybe think of it in two ways. The first being a descriptive account of the reality of our differences. We have these deep differences in society. They're about more than ice cream preferences. And so we have to figure out what to do with them. And the second definition might be, what's the political response to those differences? And the political response of pluralism would say we figure out how to live into the reality of those differences, not necessarily affirming all of them as good or right, but recognizing they're here to stay. And part of the reason for that political definition is to try to set it up and ask, what would the alternatives be? Right? Total control with violent suppression, total chaos or withdrawal, which isn't actually politics, or figuring out how we live together?
So we define things for a living, right? That's what academics do. So at Interfaith Youth Corps, we have a three-part definition of pluralism. Part one is respect for identity, which is basically you get to be who you are, right? You get to be straight or gay, evangelical Christian or atheist, right? Black Lives Matter or police union. You get to be who you are. Part two, relationships between people who are different. People who live into their identity also have to be in relationship with each other. And the third thing is some understanding or definition or way of acting into a common good, right? This sense that it's not just about person A and person B who are different and friends. It's also that we have a neighborhood school to support. We have streets to keep clean and safe. We have a kid in the neighborhood who is terribly sick, and we need to support that family, right? So there are things in the larger environment which none of us can do in an A to B sort of way. We have to do in a whole alphabet sort of way, that if we keep those things healthy, it is more likely that more of us thrive. So respect for identity, relationships between different people and communities, and some notion or commitment or support of a common good.
Great. I should also note that if you have questions, just simply write them on the sheet of paper that's on your chair. You can just raise it up, and my colleagues will be walking up and down the aisle to collect those. And then later in this program, we will gather them up and feed those questions to our two speakers. But John, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the points you made about encouraging tolerance, humility, and patience. And you talked a little bit about humility in particular, the fact that there's things that each of us believe that we can't prove, sort of an epistemological modesty. We can't always know what we know in a way that makes it accessible to others. But most people of deep faith, whatever faith it might be, are generally more concerned with deepening their knowledge of their faith than necessarily questioning it. How do you draw the distinction between cultivating a proper humility and seeding doubt?
I think I want to suggest that the one of the best resources for this question is the theologian Leslie Newbegin. And his book, Proper Confidence, the subtitle is Faith, Doubt, and Certainty in Christian Discipleship. And one of the things that book taught me or reminded me is that faith is not certainty. Right? Religious believers claim to have faith, and that necessarily means a lack of certainty and a risk, an openness to a kind of doubt. And that's not easily voiced in a lot of religious communities, but I think by definition, faith admits a kind of doubt. And that's where the humility comes in. And that's actually ultimately a deepening of faith, right? A faith that you take. We don't say leap of faith for no reason, right? You take a leap of faith, but everyone is doing that, right? Everyone, religious or not, everyone in society is taking that leap of faith into a less than perfected and fully formed understanding of the world. And you only have one life to live, and so we're all taking that leap.
Eboo, one of the things that really struck me while you were talking with incredibly compelling stories is it seems like we are all perhaps stuck in a social and cultural context that encourages division. Whether it's social media that feeds off of snark, that in a sense rewards reductionism in snark, whether it's a political context where essentially all the political incentives are in favor of division. That's how you fundraise, that's how you get more press and attention. When one finds themselves not in the role of warden, but cast in the role of either prisoner or jailer, how does one cultivate a pluralism when they're cast in a social role that encourages division?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, Tom Petty just died, right? And I'm gonna connect this, I promise.
You're gonna sing
that great theologian, right? No, I'm serious. I mean, there's some people that you just think like, like America wouldn't exist without them. I'm serious, right? Like where would America be without Woody Guthrie? And I felt like Tom Petty was one of these guys, right? And so he's got this this song called Two Gunslingers, and it's at the end of an album of his. His name I forget, but it's a red cover, and it dropped when I was in high school. And it opens by saying, two gunslingers. They meet out in this dusty road, and one says to the other, "I don't want to fight no more," right? And I love that, right? Because they have this role, and one of them's like, "I don't want to be this guy. Like, why are we doing this, right?" And the funny thing is, when you stop doing something you don't want to do, like a month later, you look back at the person who did that all the time, and you're like, what alien was that, right? So to give like a dippy example, when my first or second one of my books came out, I was one of these guys who was on Amazon every 15 minutes, like checking how well my book was doing, right? And at one point, my wife like grabs the phone at 9:30 at night and looks. And then grabs it at 9:40 at night the next time that I checked, right? And she's like, "Eboo, your book was number 44,000 in America at 9:30 and number 39,000 at 9:40. Does it really matter that much?" So I'd become one of these guys who just checked all the time. Just like you could be the kind of person who like checks your retweets all the time or checks your Facebook likes all the time. And at some point, one says to oneself, why am I doing this? I think that in a mostly free country, many of the roles that we play, we don't have to play. We don't have to be that guy all the time or that woman all the time. And so that's, for me, that is and there are much better examples, right? There are much higher level examples. I think pedestrian examples are useful. There are ways of being Christian which do not rely on, for example, being scared of Muslims. There are ways of being Muslim which do not rely on, for example, thinking that every Christian is out to get you. There are ways of doing these things. It requires some kind of psychological shift, and it requires a new narrative. Those things exist, and we live in a place in which one can think themselves into new narratives, right? And that's a really fortunate country to be in.
Can I jump in? Because I agree with you and affirm the optimism, but I'm also struck by your comments about the importance of institutional design in this. And so as you were talking up there, I was thinking of two different stories from my own life, which cut in opposite directions. The first is when I went through basic training with the Air Force and was in this barracks of people who I did not like, and within an hour, I learned to like them quite a bit because we could only get through it with each other. And so I absolutely affirm from my own experience that with the right structure and incentives, you can figure out how to work together and set aside differences. But then the other story I thought of, which seems far less hopeful to me, was in my own church after Charlottesville, this Sunday after Charlottesville. And I was walking into church feeling very heavy about this, and then listening to the conversations around me, and it hit me that there were people who had been formed during the week by, let's say, 20 hours of Fox News. And there had been people who had been formed during the week by 20 hours of Facebook engagement with Think Progress or another news outlet. And those people had constructed, by institutional design, very different narratives about and then the poor pastor had 25 minutes to get everyone on the same page around what the big truth claims are in this. And that's a real institutional challenge. That's just in one church of a largely homogenous group. And so, well, I don't want to think of basic training as the optimistic example. I do sort of wonder about on those polls, how actual institutional design structures the possibilities of changing people in the way that you suggested.
So now we're in it. So I'm just going to...
So
two quick things, right? There are countries in which there's only Fox News. In America, you can change the channel. Now, I am not saying it's easy, because we live within circles that are, in which we're constantly, in which certain symbols and language and views, we get rewarded by approval from those circles. And you are free to change the channel, right? So the more that I spend a reasonable amount of time telling people 1.7 billion Muslims can't be crazy, right? It just doesn't make sense. So when I start thinking any particular group is crazy, I have to do the mental work of undoing that tape and switching the channel. And because I am part of a minority community that no small set of people thinks is crazy because they've only heard one narrative, and it's my job to help shift that narrative, when I start doing that to another group of people, I have to switch the channel in my head, right? So part of what having some familiarity with other places in which there's literally 3 channels, I would like to celebrate American freedom by just pointing out, you can switch the channel, right? You can argue with your friends every once in a while, number one. Number two, I think the job of a leader, the job of the pastor in this situation, just like the job of the woman in the stone soup story, is to walk into a really difficult situation and ask the question, what activity, story, etc., do I enact that helps shift these social dynamics, right? And I think that is in effect what distinguishes leaders, is on the one hand, you're able to do it for yourself, and then 2 clicks up for that, you're able to do it for a larger situation. You're able to help somebody else, if you will, if not switch the channel, at least recognize that there are multiple channels and they are this deep into a particular narrative, which might be true, but it's not the only true narrative, right? As you've heard me quote ad nauseum one of my favorite lines from Susan Sontag: "Whatever is happening, there is always something else going on." Right? Whatever is happening, there is always something else going on.
We have a bunch of questions from the audience, but before we get to these, I'm going to ask just one more, which I'd love you both to comment on, which is the future of pluralism. John, you're a constitutional scholar. Presumably much of pluralism depends on safeguarding rights of freedom of speech, expression, assembly that you've talked about. But beyond that, there's also civic practices and norms and public support. And there have been a whole spate of different surveys and studies recently that have shown that support for free speech is actually in many ways lowest among the young. That college students, around 40%, think free speech is dangerous. Almost 60% of college-age guys think that shouting down someone you disagree with is okay. Nearly 20%, according to Brookings, believe that it is okay to physically prevent someone who is engaging in what is deemed hateful speech from speaking. So if freedom of speech undergirds pluralism and is losing ground, what does that mean for the future of pluralism?
Yeah, so maybe to start by upping the ante a little bit, it's not only the constitutional challenges, but the fact of pluralism is only going to get harder. Immigration trends suggest this, the differences of beliefs and views, the growing divide between transcendent and non-transcendent beliefs. So whatever challenges we have now are only going to get harder just as an empirical matter. And then the legal question you've asked is, what do we do with that and how do we strengthen these protections? I think you're right to highlight college campuses as an example, and that's one reason I'm so grateful for the work that Eboo and IFYC do in those spaces, to say, if this is the time to learn these things and learn these practices about treating people and ideas that are different than yours. But I'm also reminded, particularly in the free speech example, that Americans can't just take for granted that these ideas and values are just going to be passed down in some kind of magical or cosmic way. So the 20-something today might not know the historical lessons of McCarthyism or the 1920s and why Brandeis and Holmes went against the Supreme Court to write major cases that suggest why we value freedom of speech, even in light of the real cost that it enacts from all of us. And until we actually get in the habits of reminding each other of that and passing that along, I don't think we can assume that law and culture just stay out there in some sort of pristine way, unchanged.
We'll start with our first
That
question.
was my answer. That's it.
We'll start with our first question. Eboo, I'll ask you to respond to this first, and then we'll see if John has input as well. One of our audience members asked, it's one thing to commit to a personal initiative of pluralism and inclusiveness, but what is a practical approach to encourage others who seemingly have no interest in understanding those with opposing views to commit to the same expansion of understanding and tolerance?
So, because I spend a lot of time on college campuses, right, where there are no small number of 19, 20-year-olds with their hair on fire who believe at some level that their authenticity and their identity is connected to how much they believe in issue X, which requires distancing themselves from person Y, right? The classic line, we live at a time when we have several churches held together by the hunt for heretics, right? So this group of people views itself as a community principally because they oppose that group of people, right? So part of what I've tried to do is to create, not to go to abstract principles, probably because I'm not smart enough to abstract at that level, but to ask real world examples of, if you were in this position, what would you do? So my recent favorite one is, I understand that because of your view on issue A, B, or C, all of which are huge issues, right? The issue of abortion, same-sex marriage, immigration, Middle East politics, these are massive fundamental issues, right? You disagree with person Y on this issue. I get that. Let us say that you are a heart surgeon. Let us say that you and person Y have gone your separate ways for 15 or 20 years. You yelled at each other one last time on commencement day, and you thought to yourself, good riddance, you can go to Mars and I'll go on and live my good life. Turns out that person Y became a heart surgeon. Turned out that you walk into surgery on Wednesday morning and the person you're scheduled to perform heart surgery with, this life-saving heart surgery, is person Y. And you disagree vehemently on a fundamental issue, call it abortion, Middle East politics, whatever. Do you not do the surgery? Serious question, right? Serious question. Do you not do the surgery? You refused to sit next to this person in class. You refused to be this person's lab partner, whatever else you refused to do when you were 19 or 20 years old. You refused to do it. You are now scheduled for a life-saving heart surgery. Do you not do do you not go through with it? Right? Okay, so now let's ratchet it down. This person is now you're coaching in Little League Baseball, and you're randomly assigned assistant coaches. This person is randomly assigned to you. Turns out that his daughter is on your team. Do you not coach with him? Do you not coach his daughter? Let's go down. You happen to live in the same block. There's been a couple crimes committed in the block. Block is forming a neighborhood watch. He has the first meeting at his house. Do you not go? Like, what professionally or civically will you refuse to do with that person? Would you not be in the same barracks with that person? And if your answer to this question is, okay, I would figure it out, then it's not a bad idea to start trying to like that person now. And I'm serious, right? It's not a bad, if you can imagine a situation where you are going to work with this person, it's not a bad idea to start trying to like that person now.
Well, and the other piece of the puzzle, I think, is there are going to be those people in this country who will opt out and say, I'm not going to do the surgery. I'm not going to coach the team. And those people are relative loudmouths, both left and right. And I think the answer is we don't need them, right? And we can actually decide with a critical mass of people that there can be those people who aren't going to play the game, and we can choose differently. And I think many of us, when you look at your actual neighbors, are more of the kind that you're describing. I will say one other unrelated comment. When you're not smart enough line reminded me that you were a Rhodes Scholar. And it then reminded me that
I told a lot of stories in the interview.
I've heard the story of stone soup twice in my life, and the other one was also from a Rhodes Scholar. So I'm thinking that you guys should just get together and tell that story.
Pass notes. Pass notes. It might have been me both times.
So in our audience are many people who have the ability to create context within their neighborhoods, their organizations, their workplace, and the like. And one asks, how do we create a space that's easier for people to cooperate?
Well, I think Eboo said it earlier, but just to underscore the point, you start with the practical and the local. As I sometimes say, you work to find common ground even when you don't agree on the common good. And that's, I mean, I'm most hopeful at the local level when there are actual streets and actual schools and actual people and who can come together. And these are where all the good stories are coming from. The problem is that we don't highlight the stories enough and they don't get enough of a national scale. But I think the work of politics at the local level especially is so essential. And it's not, I mean, many of us, when we think about something like politics, we think about getting in the Thanksgiving argument with Uncle Fred, right? But politics for a lot of people is actually a life and death matter. And we in this room might have the luxury of situating it in a theoretical debate, but people are dying out there and people need other parts of the community to come around them. And so there's an imperative, I think, to focus on the local and then recognizing that focus is going to require partnerships with people with whom we disagree. And it's going to be messy, and sometimes those will be limited partnerships, but they're absolutely necessary.
By the way, this is a city that is an embarrassment of riches in this, right? So my friend Imam Pleeman is right here. Tom Glenn is here. Bob Franklin is somewhere in this room. I know half dozen, maybe more. I mean, like, you guys, you don't only do this here, but you do this in a way in which the story is told nationally, right? So this is Atlanta, in part because of Martin Luther King Jr., that legacy, the people who kind of grew up in the soil of that cooperation. But Atlanta was that place before King because it had a set of institutions, right? Ebenezer Baptist Church, Morehouse College, which was able to produce a king. So this is, I mean, look like two people to your right and left, and there are people who are doing that.
So one individual asked, what has to occur in an individual to transcend self-interest and move into social interest with personal sacrifice for that cause? What motivates someone to go through the whole thought process you were discussing of moving them from the rewards of working against someone, the easy like on Twitter, to more of a social consciousness?
I mean, for me, this is not that hard, right? Like, I don't want to be a jerk. Right? I'm serious. I don't want to be a jerk. And the times in which I'm a jerk, I know it. And I don't want to be that guy, right? Like my 20th high school reunion, there were like 3 people that I'm like, if I was ever a jerk to you, I am sorry. Right? Like the times in which I was a jerk, and it's not because I'm morally superior. I don't think any of us want to be jerks. It does not feel right to base an identity off of disliking somebody else. There is a part of that, I just think, like, as a Muslim, it's against God, right? Like, I mean, we talk about in Islam, there's the Bani Muhammad, there's the tribe of Muhammad, but larger than that is the Bani Adam. It's the tribe of Adam, right? Like that is a common ancestor. God creates Adam through a lump of clay and giving him his breath. Why would I want to base my identity on being mean to any member of the Bani Adam? That doesn't mean that there aren't individuals that I don't get mad at, but this notion of like there's a collection of people who share an identity that I'm going to base my identity on being opposed to, that just, I don't know, it seems crazy to me.
So in addition to not being a jerk, I think also I think being part of communities and groups of people that call us to something larger than ourselves is an important part of this. And that's one reason that the current fracture and anti-institutionalism is of some concern to me, because I think otherwise, I think actually the perfect example might be my own backyard in higher ed, where faculty members in general have above average egos and below average social skills and end up being, sometimes seeming like a collection of free agents without any commitment to collective sacrifice for a greater good. And until and unless we have people who are shaped by institutions and communities and groups that say there's something in this beyond you, and that's sometimes going to require sacrifice, I think it's hard to, not everyone is dispositionally not wanting to be a jerk, right? And so how do you move people into more of a habituated sense of caring for other people?
So I have an answer to that question, right, actually. So here's I think the brilliance of Martin Luther King Jr. is actually a very street level genius, which is this. He knew that he was going to have to live with the people who were spitting on him. America was not getting rid of those people, right? So King has to create an arc in which, when the inevitable was going to happen, right? When the buses were desegregated, when et cetera, schools were, et cetera, right? He hadn't contributed an iota to the stitches of conflict and distrust that he would inevitably have to then be a part of unstitching. Because human life is not getting any less diverse or interactional, right? Robert Putnam, the great sociologist, his opening line to a paper called De Pluribus Unum is, the one thing we can safely say about any society is that it is going to be more diverse in the future than it is in the present, right? So every inch we stitch of distrust, of conflict, of prejudice, of dislike, of whatever, you're going to have to unstitch at some point, right? You teach your kids, don't like those kinds of people, and I swear to God, God is going to throw you a curveball. Your kid's going to wind up rooming with that person in college, right? And then good luck unstitching that. Good luck, right? And so, I mean, I think that this is actually part of the American genius, right? I think is Washington, Jefferson, Madison recognizing, oh my gosh, we are a nation that has Jews and Catholics and Baptists and Presbyterians. Whatever we might personally feel about these other people, if we encourage any kind of ugly thinking about these different sects, we're just going to have to unstitch it in the future. So might as well create a framework in which people are more likely to cooperate.
We have a lot of great questions, and we're running out of time. We're going to take just two more before wrapping up. And one person actually gave us a twofer here, which I'll throw out to both of you. How the two of you meet, and on a practical level, what attracted you to one another? And then as well as a question for John as the constitutional scholar. Using your verbal analogy of yelling fire in a crowded theater, are there thoughts that are simply not acceptable or shouldn't be tolerated? Political treason, racism, disrespect of our flag, white supremacy, etc. Is there speech or thought that falls outside the pale?
Let me answer the second one first, and then we'll talk about our friendship. But I am close to a free speech absolutist, recognizing there are significant costs from speech. But short of, political treason is criminalized, so that's an outlier. But short of that, a lot of speech that harms people or harms the social fabric has to be allowed. That said, it was actually Eboo, you used to say, 8 months ago, we're going to have a discussion about pluralism, but let's just set aside the Nazis, right? Well, we can't do that anymore, right? We've got to talk about the Nazis. And so part of, even as a free speech absolutist, maybe I've thought, maybe we just dump the Nazis and the Klan, these two specific groups, into that category of groups that don't get to exist in this country. Sticking with Al-Qaeda. And now the free speech response to that is, wait a minute, there's a slippery slope. And I understand the slippery slope argument. There would be lots of still racially white supremacist groups out there, but those two in particular have quite an entrenched cultural traction in our country. And so would it be that bad to just put them out of bounds? I don't know. So within my free speech absolutism, I do think that those groups push the theory quite a bit. So that's the constitutional answer. Now, do you want to talk about our friendship? Say nice things.
John is smart and he's nice. Tell my kids to be friends with people who are smart and nice. So I'm modeling here. First of all, yeah, John is super smart and he's super nice. And I'm probably 2 clicks to the left. I'm probably, best described as an Obama progressive. My best guess is you're probably 2 clicks to the right, 1 or 2 clicks to the right. I think that's, am I wrong about that?
I kind of do a little dance sometimes, but that's fine. We're different for sure. Yeah.
We would probably have different views on who should be in the Supreme Court. That might bring out those.
Or who should not be on the Supreme Court.
Or who should not, right. Those 2 clicks either way, right? But I think what we agree on at a gut level is how people should talk to each other, right? And I think that was apparent right away. That people should talk to each other in a manner that seeks to learn and that is as much as possible gentle and kind and it's easy to learn from you because you're so smart and so nice.
And as are you.
Thank you.
But I would also say, in some ways, what I love about what we do is we can talk about this till the sun goes down, but we actually kind of model it naturally. And so you and I haven't actually had a lot of deep policy discussions about what might be some very contested issues. But we have talked about what it means to be dads to our kids and what it means to travel a lot and be away from kids and what it means to try to run institutions and work with colleagues and what it means to lose friends. So we've connected over a lot of human interactions, and that's been really, other than talking about what books we want to read, that's been the bulk of our interaction. And that models, we start with a lot of common ground instead of starting with all of the issues that might divide us.
So for our last question, which I'll ask you two to tackle before Price Harding comes to close us out, really goes to a heart question. Our listener,
that wasn't a heart question?
Right.
I thought I was burying my soul here.
Who says, tolerance, humility, and patience only seem to hold power if practiced with true and genuine love. Or do you simply fake it till you make it when it comes to pluralism?
I mean, I'm okay with faking it, right? I would welcome a little faking at this point in our country's moment. And modeling is important, right? Even modeling when people are faking it. I mean, it matters. It matters what people with platforms say and do, whether they mean it or not. Now, ultimately, I think, yes, motivated by love and authenticity, that matters for the long haul, and we have to. This is back to the point about habituated practices. We have to form people who actually live into this. But until we get there, I'm okay with a little bit of faking.
Eboo, last word.
At the personal level, find things you admire about people you disagree with, right? At the level of leader, design environments in which people's inspiring commonalities are more salient than their deep and real differences.
One more sentence about how leaders do that.
On my 7-year-old's little league team is coached by a Palestinian guy and a Jewish guy, and they focus on baseball, right? And I actually am the one who pointed out to them that they were Palestinian and Jewish. And I'm like, I think I'm going to write an article about you. And they're like, oh, we're just baseball coaches, right? So in so many ways, this happens very, very naturally because most interactions are about, hey, you're a dad, I'm a dad. You're a soccer coach, I'm a soccer coach. You're a parent, I'm a parent, right? But I think it is, this is no longer true. But this line, you might have heard it some years back about, scientists could never figure out a way that the bumblebee could fly. Its wings were too short, its body was too big. Scientists have now figured that way out. But I loved it when they didn't figure it out because the bumblebee didn't give a damn, it just flew, So I love that, right? Like most of the time in most parts of America, people in individual interaction do not think, hey, wait a second, you're going to go home and imbibe Fox News, and I'm going to go home and imbibe MSNBC. They soccer coach together, right? That's the beauty of local communities. And so they're doing it naturally. What I'd love to do is make a political philosophy out of that. You see what I'm saying? Is to say, here's a situation which exists 1,000 times a day in 1,000 local communities. Let's point it out, right? And let's figure out how to do more of that. Let's figure out how to do more of that.
Eboo, Patel, John Inazu, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Price Harding. I'm chairman of the board of the Trinity Forum. I live right here in Atlanta, almost walking distance from where we are. My wife Nancy, and I. I do want to thank you for being here tonight, and I want to really thank our speakers. I mean, that was just phenomenal. In the little reception just before we got started, somebody asked me, "What is it about these events that really attracts you?" And I kind of stumbled through an answer. And then as I was sitting here tonight, I began to realize that I could probably, I don't know how many channels we've got on our TV. I don't watch it much, but maybe 200 channels. I don't know. I could probably flip through every one of them and probably not on any one of them find anything that's as substantive, that's as meaningful, that's as practical, that frankly is as warming as what we heard tonight. In fact, on probably 90% of them, I could find the exact contradiction, the antithesis of what we heard tonight, and all of the problems that ultimately arise from that. And so once again, I just want to thank our speakers for bringing it to Atlanta. Thank you so much. We're just so grateful. Thank you. It's always hard for something like this to come to an end. And the good news is it really doesn't have to. And there are two ways that it can continue in your life. One of those is through the Trinity Forum reading groups, which are becoming increasingly prevalent in Atlanta. At our last event this spring, we announced the start of reading and discussion groups, and now over the summer, 5 groups have met to Martin Luther King's extraordinary letter from a Birmingham jail with an introduction by Ambassador Andrew Young and Bob Franklin. So there are opportunities like that. And over the next year and a half, we're going to hold other discussion groups to read together about the amazing example of William Wilberforce and how he, along with a group of neighbors, brought about an unprecedented change in his own country and what lessons may be applicable to our own context. We'll read excerpts from Nelson Mandela's autobiography and reflect on his insistence of how forgiveness helped unify and heal his riven country. And in the next few months, we'll focus also on Václav Havel's remarkable reflections on politics, morality, and civility, and how his insistence on civility changed the course of Czech history and what it might mean for our own time. And so while all of those things sound really kind of theoretical, philosophical, and intellectual, there's a practicality to understanding those things in the same way that you encountered in this evening's message. And so I hope that you'll take advantage of one of those reading groups and participate in such a way as to take that which feels somewhat esoteric and make it real in our lives. That's one way. There is a second way, and that's by joining the Trinity Forum Society. And that helps make discussions like this possible, not only in Atlanta, but in other places around the country. So for those of you who joined tonight, we've actually left a little flyer on your seat. And if you don't have it in your hand, you're likely sitting on it. And so, but it gives you the opportunity to join the Trinity Forum Society. And for those who join tonight, we'll give you a free and signed copy of Confident Pluralism, John Inazu's book. And so there are other benefits also from being part of the Trinity Forum Society that include our quarterly Trinity Forum readings, a sample of which are on the table outside, monthly podcast interviews with thought leaders, and the daily What We Are Reading curated recommendations. So I really hope that you'll take advantage of that. And our staff is here tonight to help you sign up for that and participate in that. And if you'd like to share this evening's event with others, we'll have photos on our Facebook page and we'll be posting videos shortly. As we come to a close, there are some people that I need to thank. And so we mentioned them before, but our sponsors for this evening, Jack Alexander, David Allman, Jim and Julie Balloon, Chris Batchelder, Mark DeMoss, Jackie and John Coleman, Susanna Dryman, John Featherston, the Lovett School, Jenny Pruitt, Matt Teague, Scotland and Peggy Wright. Want to say thank you for all of that. And if you're interested in sponsoring future events, we'd welcome that. and would be just delighted to have you join the other sponsors in participating in that. As we come to a close, I just want to point out one comment that Dr. Patel made. You mentioned the fact that to some extent, Atlanta, and I won't quote you perfectly, but Atlanta has almost a plethora of examples, an embarrassment of riches in terms of some of the things that you were talking about tonight. And it does feel, living here, that we do have something really special. I mean, it feels like different than what I see on television, different than what I can encounter in a lot of other cities, different than anything that's happened. It's not been a 5-year thing. It's been maybe a 40-year thing. And Atlanta is not without its faults. It's certainly not a perfect city. But I'll close with these two things. I want to thank you really for observing that and mentioning it. And I would encourage all of us to make that reality and to really carry these things into the city and to be, as much as possible, the kind of light that we've heard described here so perfectly tonight. And so with those words, I want to thank you all for coming and hope that you'll continue to participate with us as we move through these future conversations. Thanks so much.
Thank you, friend.